Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We have entered into Module 2, and this is artifact number 1. And for the sake of clarity for the next couple of modules, much of what we will be looking at will be art and architecture that somehow engages with or is involved with the Christian faith. I mean, the art of the Western world is dominated by the Christian faith beginning in the 4th century, and this carries on through towards the Enlightenment. So there will be a lot of ways for us to discuss the ways in which Christianity has impacted and has perpetuated some of the great art of our Western culture. And we will, of course, take some diversions to other cultures as well. But we begin today by looking at the Arch of Constantine. This is dated about 315 in the Common Era. And just for the sake of clarity, from now on, anytime I mention a date, you can assume that's in the Common Era rather than before the Common Era. And so what you're looking at here is a picture of the Arch of Constantine that I took, oh golly, a long, long time ago from the upper part of the Colosseum. So the Arch of Constantine and the Colosseum are practically neighbors. And if you were to walk out of the Arch of Constantine, make a left-hand turn and walk 100 meters, you would find the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Constantine was constructed in 315 after Constantine finished kind of a civil war with his co-emperors. And in artifact number 9, I believe, I showed you these objects, the 4 tetrarchs. And the tetrarchy kind of worked for a while, but eventually Constantine decided that he wanted all of the power and not just some of the power. And so a large-scale Roman civil war began. And Constantine, as time would play out, was actually the victor. Although he owed that victory in some interesting ways to something that would surprised him. According to legend, and I like the legend, so I want to believe it, the night before a victory, and the battle was called the Battle of the Filvian Bridge, Constantine, this is not him, but Constantine had a dream. And in that dream, he saw an angel, and an angel was carrying a flag. And the flag had a symbol on it. The flag was called the Chi-Rho. And this shield here, and here's a detail of it there, that is called the Chi-Rho. The Chi-Rho is the first 2 letters of Christ's name in the Greek alphabet. And it was an early symbol of the Christian faith. And I pause here to say that the Christian faith prior to this time frame is against Roman law. And as a result, we certainly don't have very many Christians. And those who we have certainly are practicing their faith in private and in secret. So Constantine has this dream. And in the dream, an angel arrives carrying a flag. And on that flag is the Chi-Rho, an early symbol for the Christian faith. And the angel says to Constantine, "It is in this sign that you will conquer." Now, Constantine takes this as an omen to mean that it's through a Christian battle, like with Christian soldiers, that he will win this war. And the next day, he has all of his soldiers paint this symbol on their shields. And of course, Constantine wins a great victory. The Roman world remains intact in whatever way Constantine would have kept it. And this was the beginning of the Christian world being an accepted one within Rome. So this battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, is a really, really important time frame within Roman life because prior to this, being a Christian, strictly speaking, was against the law. And we'll talk about what this means as it pertains to the Christian communities around the world in just a second. Now, when you go to Rome, and you should, there is a museum there. I've already mentioned it once. It's called the Capellini Museum. It's where the large-scale statue of Marcus Aurelius is. And in there are bits and pieces of an enormous statue of Constantine. The statue itself dates from 325. Here you can see a bicep, a head, what I think is the top of a knee, and a hand. And there you have a local neighborhood scale figure. That is my wife standing next to it. Here's his foot. I mean, that is a really serious flipper. And this allows us to talk about some of the really important things about Constantine. Because one can make the claim that you could remove an emperor here or there, and that they don't fundamentally contribute to what our world is today. But Constantine is not one of those guys. Like his importance is remarkable in a lot of ways. And as a historian, I am not the kind of person who is a you need to remember this date kind of guy. I mean, I think there's only 3 dates that I ask students to learn, but one of them is this: 313. 313. In 313, we have the Edict of Milan. And this is a governmental decree that allows Christians to legally practice their religion without, and I say this in jest, without being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. Like prior to that, it's just illegal. And so think about this. Imagine being named Sarah is illegal, right? It's against the law. It's a dumb law, but it's against the law. You're not going to wear a t-shirt that says my name is Sarah. You're not going to have your LL Bean canvas bag with the name Sarah monogrammed on it. You're just not going to. So if it's illegal to be that thing, you're going to be that thing, but you're going to be it in secret, and you're not going to brag about it. And so prior to 313, we don't have churches. Churches existed, of course. People were practicing the Christian faith. Not a lot of people, I grant you, but people were. But it's only after the Edict of Milan that we begin to see Christian spaces. And that's a really, really important idea. And because I got you writing stuff down, let me tell you that Constantine then moves the entire Roman world, like the center of the Roman world, from Rome to the Council of Nicaea, or pardon me, to Constantinople. The city was called Byzantium, but he eventually renames it Constantinople, which I really like. I mean, move the city, name it after yourself. Another important thing happens in 325, and that is the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea. And in 325, this was the beginning of the Roman Catholic faith being systematically integrated into the Roman world. And so let me say something about all of this. There is no Protestant church, there is only the church. There's only one church. It's the Holy Mother Church, the Catholic Church. Catholic with a big C means like the formal religion. Catholic with the little c means universal. So there's no Protestant church. There's no Martin Luther. There's no Baptist church. There's only the big church. And this idea is an important one because early on in 325, it is completely unified. Completely might be a tough word, but there's only one sort of form of the Catholic faith. That year, at the Council of Nicaea, we have the Nicene Creed created. And as someone who grew up in the Catholic tradition, this is a part of every Catholic Mass I've ever been through. And it's changed over time. It's changed in my own lifetime. But the Nicene Creed, or what's called the Profession of Faith, is usually, I can't think of a Mass where it's not spoken. And it goes a little something like this, the kind of thing you learn in Sunday school when you're 7. I always learned it as we believe, and I really like the idea of being we, but it's now I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things seen and unseen. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father, before all ages, God from light, light from true light, eternally begotten, not made. He is one with the Father. It goes on and on. And at the end of that, there's like, we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That has been part of the Catholic faith since 325. And then another year to write down, and I will sort of express my amazedness at this. In 380, Theodosius makes the Christian faith the official faith of the Roman Empire. Let's think about this in regards to time. In 312, it's against the law to be Christian. 68 years later, it's the only form of faith that's allowed to be practiced in the empire. This is a staggering transformation from illegal to illegal to be anything but. And the Christians now have a problem. They have a problem in how to express themselves from an architectural point of view so as not to confuse their faith with the older heathen faith that existed before it. And as a way to get there, I give you a diagram, like a drawing, of a building called the Basilica Nuovo, quite literally the new basilica. And this is what the building looks like now. And again, a picture taken from the Colosseum. The building dates from around 306, and you can see it is a rectangular structure. So we have a long end, we have two short ends, and we have a little nook here on the side. And in that little nook was a great big statue of Constantine. Here are the bits and pieces of him that survive. The entrance into this building was along the long side of the building. It's bisected by three large barrel vaults, which is a Roman arch that extends through space. We talked about this in artifact number 10. And this was a governmental building. For the Romans, a basilica was a government building. The orientation is along the long side, and it's a kind of courthouse, government structure. This is not a religious building. You've seen a Roman religious building. I'll bring it back to you just so you have a sense of clarity. Roman religious building there. This is what a Roman religious building looked like. This was a government building. And this is Old St. Peter's. Old St. Peter's does not exist anymore because wood buildings don't last 1,700 years. Actually, they last about 1,000 years. And beginning around 1300 in the Common Era, this church was in such bad shape that they began to make plans to replace it. And so now the building that is where this was is now called New St. Peter's. It's the Vatican. But this is a drawing of what Old St. Peter's looked like. And in many ways, this building mimics what we see in the Basilica Nuovo. It is a rectangular building with long sides and short sides and with a little nook there, right? So there's the little nook. There's the little nook. And even if you look at it from the side, you can see the similarities. But what the early Christians did was took this government building, changed the orientation from the long side where the entrance is here to the short side where the entrance is here, and they made this into a religious structure. This is the so-called Basilica planned church. The Basilica planned church. And the Basilica planned church has some remarkable advantages for it that we'll talk about in a little while. But to begin with, I want to talk about some vocabulary. Because in order to understand the transformation of the Christian church over the course of the next millennia, we really need to understand some of the changes that are happening in the nomenclature. So let's begin with the main aisle of a church, this right here. Number one is called the nave. Nave is fancy speak for main aisle of a church. And if you have a main aisle of a church, you might often have side aisles, and here they are there. Old St. Peter's had 4 side aisles, 2 flanking the main nave. This right here, 3, that little nook that we see quite consistently in the Basilica Nuovo there, within a Christian context, this becomes the apse. The apse is the most holy spot in a church. It is where the altar is. It's where the relics are usually housed. It is where the the homily is delivered, the bread and wine blessed and consecrated. It is where the scripture is read. So that is the apse. Churches, like Old St. Peter's, often had an outside space. We called that outside space the atrium. This was a place for the faithful to gather before they entered the church. And the other thing I would point out here is what we call the transept. The transept is the crossing of one part of the church here with another part of the church there. And in some ways, it makes this sort of look like an uppercase T. We'll see that change over time. The other thing I'd point out is this right here, my friends. That is called the narthex. Narthex is really fancy phrase for entrance way into a church. So this is a basilica plan of the church. It becomes standard operating church procedure for several hundred years, and it has some really great advantages, and that is the faithful all stand facing the same direction, right? Like you can pack people filled with this in this space, and they're all going to look down towards the apse and see the same thing. Old St. Peter's, it's estimated 4,000 people can stand in that interior space. It was big. Just to give you an idea, it's over a football field in size. So some 4,000 people could stand in the nave, and you could get more in the side aisle if you needed to. So this becomes the way in which we begin to think about early Christian architecture. But early Christian architecture doesn't spring up and develop overnight. And one of the things we're constantly aware of is the ways in which the Christians ease into adapting classical models for their own spaces. And one of the transitional objects for that is this building here. It's called Santa Costanza. And this is just on the outskirts of Rome. If you're at Termini train station and you take the 40 bus, about 15 minutes away, it will take you out here. This dates from around 337. Constantina was one of Constantine's daughters. And what you're looking at here is her sort of mausoleum, her burial structure. It eventually became a place of worship. It was originally designed as a resting place for her sarcophagus. And in a lot of ways, it shows you something that we will see within the early Christian world through the Byzantine world, and that is the exterior of the structures are relatively austere and not super decorated. And as we work our way through the medieval world, the outsides will become much more decorated. The insides still too. But right now, the outside of this is like, ho-hum, nothing much fantastic going on. And I want to show you a plan of the building and a plan of the Pantheon, because we'll see the ways in which these things are clearly related. And to give you an idea, the distance from this structure, Santa Costanza, and this structure, the Pantheon, is probably like 7 miles. I'm guessing that's right. I should double check, but I'm guessing 7 miles, which is less than the distance from my house then to Louisiana Tech University. One of the things we can think about this object is that it is round, right? The plan of this building is round, which is exactly the plan of this building. And they both have a dome kind of structure. In this instance, the dome here rests on this, not the whole thing. But this right here, my friends, is the narthex. You walk through the narthex into this, and the structure itself is kind of comprised of a donut and a donut hole. This is the donut part. And this ambulatory has a very specific religious function that we'll talk about in a second. Let me move that back. So this is the donut part. The donut hole is the part of the structure where the sarcophagus was placed, and now there's an altar there. This is called a centrally planned church. A centrally planned church. The ambulatory, the word ambulatory comes from the Latin word ambulatare, which means quite literally to walk. To walk. So one can ambulate, it means to walk. And I sort of have a running joke about running on a treadmill, right? This is sort of, or running around an interior track. You just go around and around, and in doing so, you don't need to think about where you're walking. You're always going straight and turning left. And so this ambulatory becomes a place for people to walk and think, reflect and pray. Later on, when this becomes a church, they're going to put an altar here. And then people will stand around the ambulatory looking in at the center of the structure. So that's why it's called centrally planned. If you were to imagine the interior part of the ceiling of the ambulatory, it kind of looks like a donut, right? If you were to cut off top of the donut or think about the top of a donut, it kind of looks like that. And it is filled with mosaics. Mosaics. A mosaic is constructing a scene out of small bits of colored rock, glass, and metal. And so there are mosaics all along the inside of this ambulatory here. You can sort of make them out a little bit. And this is standing looking inside that church towards the central part. And you can see here the dome. The dome is the drum of the dome is filled with these archway windows, which provide just a lovely, beautiful kind of interior illumination of this structure. Here you can see a mosaic, a section of the mosaic of the inside of this ambulatory. And it's not by coincidence that I show you this one, because here is a picture of Constantina. I've kind of made her a little bit bigger here and rotated her. Here she is, her picture. And I ask you to look at what has been placed around her, because I'm really fascinated by this. I think it's a really, really interesting structure. We have around her a little guy carrying a basket of grapes. Over here, they're carrying wheat, and these are grapevines and wheat. So what do you need to create wine? Well, you need grapes. What do you need to create bread? You need wheat. And because I'm a baker now, salt and yeast. But that's all you need, is salt, yeast, and flour. And so inside this, we have Constantina being shown in a vineyard and in a wheat field. And certainly the Christians do not invent wheat. They do not invent grapes. They do not invent bread. They do not invent wine. But it's during the Christian time frame that those objects take on a particular Christian context for them. This is my body, the body of the new and everlasting covenant. This is my blood. It will be given for you and for all, so that sins may be forgiven. Blood and wine and body and bread become foundational visual elements of the Christian faith. And here we have them being shown with Constantina in her burial vault. And that is a really, really interesting idea. Now, to be fair, they haven't gone all in on the Christian faith, because we still have some pagan iconography all around this structure. But this building, it strongly places Constantina in a Christian context. It's a centrally planned building, and there's some disadvantages of centrally planned buildings. One, you can make them big, right? The Pantheon's big, and you can fill it with a lot of people, but not as many people as a gigantic rectangle. But secondly, no matter what, people are going to be looking at slightly different things. So if I'm Father Brian and this is my altar, and there are people standing all the way around it, people inevitably are going to be seeing different things. Those in front of me, thankfully, will be seeing the front of me. Those behind me, unfortunately, will be looking at things behind me, and that's not a great viewpoint. And so as a result, people are going to be looking at slightly different things. And that's one of the distinct disadvantages of centrally planned churches. This, however, was never really designed as a church. It was designed as a mausoleum of sorts. And another great one that I finally had a chance to visit in 2019 is this one. It's Gala Placidia. And this is in Ravenna, and it dates from around 425. And let me show you something that I had no idea about. This building is right next to this building, and I had no idea until I went there. This, if you follow this right here, it takes you to Galla Placidia right there. It's like right there. I had no idea. And so this is a building also in Ravenna from the early Byzantine period called San Vitale. We'll come back to that in our next artifact, but for the time being, know that you can see this building. Like if you just turn around, you'll see Galla Placidia, like on the other side of this wall here. This is a great example of some of the interesting things that are happening in Ravenna in the early part of the 5th century. And let me show you a map of Ravenna because there's some really cool things that are happening there. Here's Rome, there's Ravenna. And to give you an idea, it was about 3 hours on a train to get up there. Florence is over here. And during the early Christian time frame, Rome falls to a variety of bad guys from the north. You might know them as the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Huns. And they come in and pretty much destroy Rome. A lot of the Forum is destroyed. A lot of things survive, right? The Pantheon survives and some of the Colosseum survives. But the center of the Italian Christian world moves from Rome to Ravenna. Of course, like like Rome has moved to Constantinople anyway. And so this was a burial structure. And when you go visit it, and there's a doorway right here. And now the doorway has like a red curtain in front of it. So to keep it dark, because the only other illumination in the building are these windows here and here. And they're covered with this really beautiful, thinly shaved alabaster, which light up this room in this really, really beautiful way. And the structure itself is filled with mosaics. And so what you're looking at here is the central vault here, and we have symbols of our 4 gospel writers. The first 4 books of the Christian Bible are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And here we have in the ceiling vault a blue lapis ceiling with a golden cross and stars, and then allegorical representations of our 4 gospel writers. This will show up again and again to us. Matthew is shown as a man, Mark as a lion, Luke as an ox, and John as an eagle. And so these mosaics show up in the corners in these little vault areas, and they're just lovely. So there is our lion and our ox and our eagle. In a couple modules time, we will look at some depictions of Matthew and the ways in which he's shown. Now this is facing inward at Galla Placidia with our back to the door, and I'll show you some interesting things. Over here we have St. Peter and Paul, and over here we have St. Lawrence. And this shows some very interesting mosaics that will be worth exploring in due time. So one of the things we need to talk about when we speak about mosaics are the ways in which they seemingly are able to depict 3D realistic scenes with small bits of stone and glass. And this is a really, really important idea that will have repercussions both in the Byzantine world and also beyond. And so as a way to get there, let's spend our time looking at a couple of these because I think they're super, super interesting. Up top, we have our 2 patron saints of Rome. They are Saint Peter and St. Paul. Here they've been constructed in this little nook to make it look as if it's 3-dimensional. They're wearing Roman garments. Both actually made it to Rome, although they hardly would have considered themselves Roman. And underneath that, you can see we have a depiction of St. Lawrence. And you might be, how I know it's St. Lawrence? Well, 2 things. One, I'm smart. And secondly, I have in my hand here a copy of Butler's Lives of the Saints. Um, and I think it's a pretty interesting book. It's a really old book that has been subsequently re-released and over the course of hundreds of years. And one of the things I love about being Catholic is that we have a sense of humor and we're actually kind of funny. And so Saint Lawrence is a Catholic saint who was put to death around the year 258. Um, and and I want to read you the entry to his life in Butler's Lives of the Saints. His saint day is August 10th. So here we go. The Emperor Valerian in 257 published his edicts against Christians and Pope Saint Sixtus, the second of that name. It sounds like Game of Thrones. I love it. And the second of that name was apprehended that year, following and put to death. On the fourth day after the faithful deacon, Lawrence followed him to martyrdom. That is all that is known for certain of the life and death of St. Lawrence, but Christian piety has adopted and consecrated as its own the details supplied by St. Ambrose, the poet Prudentius, and others. According to these traditions, as Pope Sixtus was led to execution, his deacon Lawrence followed him, weeping, and said to him, "Father, where are you going without your deacon?" The Pope answered, "I do not leave you, my son. You shall follow me in 3 days." During this interval, Lawrence went all over the city, seeking out the poor who were supported by the church. On the third day, he gathered together a great number of them. When he went to the prefect and invited him to come and see the treasures of the church, the prefect, astonished to see such an assembly of misery and misfortune, turned to the deacon and threatening looks and asked him what he meant and where were the treasures with which he had promised to show him. St. Lawrence answered, "What are you displeased at? These are the treasures of the church." The prefect's anger was redoubled, and he had a great gridiron made ready, with glowing coals put underneath it, and the martyr might have been slowly cooked. Lawrence was stripped and bound upon the iron bed over the slow fire, which roasted his flesh by little and little. Having suffered a long time, he turned to the judge and said with a cheerful smile, "Let my body be turned. One side is broiled enough." When the executioners had turned him, he said, "It is cooked enough. You may now eat." Then, having prayed for the conversion of the city of Rome and that the faith of Christ might spread thence throughout the world, St. Lawrence gave up the ghost. He is now the patron saint of cooks. And if that isn't hysterical, my friends, I don't know what is. The guy was grilled to death, and he is now the patron saint of Weber grills. And here he is standing, holding a cross, gigantic gold dinner plate around him, wearing the gospel, and the grill, the tool of his martyrdom, shown in front of him. The cabinet next to him here is opened, and here you can see the four Gospels. In Latin, I grant you, but the four Gospels: Marcus, Lucas, Johannes, and Matthias. And there is the grill. I think this is just fabulous. This is a small scale burial structure, right? There's a sarcophagus, sarcophagus, and sarcophagus. And it's tiny. Like when I finally got in here, when there were 10 people in this space, you were elbowing people out of the way. And so it's a very small space. But on one of the scenes, there is a depiction of Christ as the Good Shepherd. And I want to call your attention to this right here because it is a really interesting structure. Let me make this white. Is a really interesting structure because it does not necessarily fit in with what we think of Christ. But here is Christ with a gigantic gold dinner plate halo, holding a cross, wearing gold and purple. And the wearing of purple is the imperial color. When we looked at Augustus, I said to you that Augustus wears purple because it is the imperial color. and Christ as the ruler on heaven and on earth is shown wearing this color. He's youthful, he's beardless, and if I were to ask you to describe Jesus, and you would probably say, well, he's a 30-year-old guy with beard. And this is not what he looks like to us. This is a youthful figure. And as a matter of fact, he has been shown, this is the way he's been shown quite frequently in early Christian art. Let me show you a statue. This dates from about 50 years beforehand, but it is a seated Christ. And you know what this Christ has been shown as? Get ready. Apollo. Apollo is a youthful god, and Apollo has a job. You know what Apollo's job is? He carries the sun across the sky. And as a result, Apollo is often shown with a gold disc behind his head. So the idea of halos, for the Christian, it is a marker of holiness, of piety, or of martyrdom. And for the Greeks, Apollo, it's merely a representation of his day job of carrying the sun across the nighttime sky. The ways in which we consider Christ changes over time. I mean, not far away in Ravenna is from Galla Placidia is San Apollinare Nuovo. It's maybe a 12-minute walk if you don't get lost. And in there are various depictions of a really youthful Christ wearing the imperial purple and gold. And this is the miracle of the loaves and fishes. And this does not appear typical for our image of Christ, but this was a very classical representation of him prior to the Byzantine period. Jesus was seldom shown crucified. It just wasn't a representation that early Christians embraced. But this is an early one. It dates from around 420, and it's an carving in ivory. You can think of ivory as being like bone, right? So it's made out of bone, and carved into it we have this depiction of Christ. Here he is crucified. Here you say the King of the Jews, which has been carved in above it. And over here has been hung Judas, right? He's hanging from the tree. There's the sack of money, sack of silver underneath him. And I ask you to think about this representation of the crucified Christ, because all things considered, this doesn't look to be such a bad deal. Like, I've never been Christ. I've never had nails go through my hands, but all things considered, this does not seem to be anything other than a fantastic gymnastics move. This is not a painful rendition of crucifixion. This is not torturous. This is not, oh Father, why art thou forsaken me? We will see the way in which Christ has been crucified change over the centuries. Early on, depictions of the crucified Christ were really uncommon. I mean, there were scenes of redemption, but this is the end of the bad part, right? Like this is the death of Christ. The resurrection is joyful. The death is sorrowful. And so we don't see crucifixions, although now it has become the go-to symbol of Christians. Like if you see people wearing a cross, like if a Christian wants to identify themselves publicly with jewelry, it's often with a cross that you see it, a symbol of his death, and not a symbol of a fish, which was much more common. But these early representations of Christians was not crucifixions. It was various other symbols like fishes and kairos. When we come back for artifact 2 of module 2, we're going to look at Byzantine art and architecture. And we call Byzantine art because it is begun in Byzantium. Byzantium is what we called Constantinople before Constantine changed the name. And so in the East, around Byzantium, we have the development of different kinds of artistic ideas that are going to be somewhat at odds and be separate from the kinds of things we see in early Christian art. And that will be the focus of Artifact 2. There will be echoes of Roman art, of course, but those echoes and whispers will tell a different story.